So in the contemporary era, so today, the CBC doesn't, for example, teach a lot of animal husbandry. It doesn't do that. But that's not to say that those sort of services don't still exist and that the CBC's process and programming isn't evolving. So as much as they're sort of working with the development of more local news, they create local news bureaus in 1941. So in Alberta, for example, that means a news bureau in Edmonton and one in Calgary. And they were consolidated at one point. I believe there were sort of 3 or 4 of them. That changes a little bit when you've got sort of reliable internet that can upload audio and that kind of stuff. But television comes online at the CBC in 1947, so they're still producing television, including some things that you guys may have seen. So, for example, Schitt's Creek is originally a CBC production, as is The Nature of Things, if you're sort of familiar with that. There's a number of others sort of that have kind of been picked up and sort of are available on services that most of my students watch, and that I doubt very many of you watch a lot of broadcast television, but some of those services, those have been picked up by the streaming services, so there's that kind of thing. The really sort of important thing from a nation building perspective that the CBC does is it produces Canadian content. And this is a whole thing that we could definitely dig into in sort of much more depth, but the idea of Canadian content means a couple of different things. On the one hand, it can mean stories about Canada. So this could be a story set in Regina, or a story set in Victoria, or in Peace River. That is one way of looking at Canadian content, but when you have to sort of boil it down to a technical question, you wind up with some other sort of questions. So Canadian content in that perspective, like the sort of legally defined one, might be written by a Canadian. So the author, like the screenwriter is Canadian, that kind of thing. The person who wrote the script, the actors are Canadian, the director is Canadian, it was produced in Canada, all of those sorts of things. And those ideas about Canadian content are important for sort of 2 really different reasons that are very closely connected. When we're talking about telling stories about Canada, that's one thing, and that's sort of an important part of this in terms of understanding what other people in the world, in the country, are living like. But when we start talking about why do we call it Canadian content if it's just like if it's a sci-fi script or an animated piece or something like that that just happened to be written by someone who is from Canada, and the real answer to that question is because the CBC and the federal government is interested, or rather the federal government acting primarily through the CBC, one of the things they are interested in is making sure that there are Canadians who can make a living telling their stories. So, for example, even if the person writing the story isn't writing anything about Canada, this is a story that takes place in like the past, under the ocean, wherever that is, there's still something valuable from the government's perspective in terms of nation building, in terms of having people who are skilled at telling those stories, who sort of live the Canadian experience, whether that means sort of they are skilled at writing those scripts, or they're skilled at taking a script or a piece of music and turning it into something that people want to watch or listen to, and that kind of thing. That sort of spills over into the produced in Canada piece, because you've probably not had a ton of time to think about this, but in terms of making television or music, there's actually a lot of technical stuff that goes on in the background in terms of how do you get the sound quality right, how do you get the lighting right, where do you need to put the cameras, how do you set this up, how do you sort of manage this logistically, and having people have skills in all of those things in Canada makes it possible to tell Canadian stories, because it means, for example, that if the National Film Board decides to commission a film about, I don't know, sort of climate change in the Canadian Arctic and how it's affecting teenagers, which is a very National Film Board thing to do. If they want to make that film, they don't have to bring in lighting techs and sound techs from outside the country, because there are a number of them who are working and who are professional at what they're doing and who will be able to sort of work with that production sort of piece. If you're not familiar, there are Canadian content regulations on broadcast television anyway. So, for example, Global, CTV, all of that sort of stuff, they have to broadcast a certain amount of Canadian content, so stuff that was written and produced by, um, and they have to do, and it is sort of there. It's even more specific than that in terms of like this percentage needs to be between sort of 5 o'clock and 11 o'clock, because apparently the first time they tried to do this, the broadcasters were like, oh yeah, sure, I guess we'll put Canadian content on, and threw it all on at 3 o'clock in the morning when no one's watching television, which is sort of defeating the point of the Canadian content requirement. Um, just to sort of bring this, I guess, a little bit more full circle, so you guys are aware, Canadian Heritage Minutes were used, at least when I was growing up, quite often to fulfill those Canadian content requirements, because you can put them on in your commercial breaks, and you can show a minute of something, but that minute counts as Canadian content, so you can broadcast something else that you prefer, or that makes you sort of more money in that sort of space. Similar rules exist for music and stuff like that, but I'm not sort of going to get into all of the details about that. So that's like part of that. The CBC still fulfills some of those sort of education and consultation sort of pieces. The CBC still hosts a lot of sort of call-in talk radio shows. People they sort of do the sort of follow-up and sort of taking people's pulse. So if you are listening, or the CBC is on it a lot in my car, so I will say that. But if you're listening around noon, you'll hear sort of an Alberta at Noon program, and that is usually something that is of local interest, and people can call in and sort of ask questions and say, I think this, I'm worried about this. I heard one a couple of weeks ago about, are you still planning to go south for the winter? Are you still planning to sort of go to Mexico, go to Costa Rica, that kind of thing? And people were sort of calling and saying yes or no, and they had they had some physicians on to sort of talk about whether or not they would recommend that and under what circumstances. So we can do that kind of public consultation piece. It's less official now, and that those things don't usually go to the government, but it does allow people the space to sort of recognize whether or not their opinions are in line with what everyone else is thinking. And there is still that education piece. So we were talking about immigration and refugee policy sort of last week, but there are a number of really interesting specialists who work at the CBC who develop language learning programming to accompany CBC broadcasts. So this will be, for example, workbooks about learning English or French vocabulary, depending on where you are in the country, following along with sort of planned broadcasts of CBC sort of news and entertainment programming, so that there's a mechanism for people who are new to the country to learn the language without necessarily having to seek out a formal class, and still get some structured instruction, as rather than just sort of like hanging out and waiting till you learn English or wait until you learn French. That said, there are still very much a lot of conversations about whether or not this kind of programming and this kind of Canadian content question is still necessary. This sort of comes up all the time when we start talking about defunding the CBC. And people sort of say that that's not that whether that is necessary or not, right? There's that question about how we sort of talk about this. The CBC is often one of the only places that you will get sort of Indigenous content in terms of radio that sort of approaches those ideas. So there's some questions about whether defunding the CBC is in fact a racist action. So we've got some conversations there. But that said, all of those sort of like abstract pieces, there's some really important questions about the CBC that remain, which is to say, okay, this is supposed to create a unified sort of contemporary image of Canada where people can relate to each other because they have some cultural pieces that sort of like they can all relate to in terms of they're watching the same television shows, they're talking about the same issues. But there's a question about whether or not that makes sense, given the relatively small number, especially of young people, who actually consume content made by the CBC. So if I'm doing this class in person, I will often sort of sit down and be like, all right, how many of you guys have listened to CBC radio in the last sort of week or so? And normally in a class of 40 or 50 people, I will have like 4 hands go up. And that sort of creates some really interesting questions about the value of the CBC to do something like create a national identity when less than 10% of sort of a really important demographic is actually consuming that content, right? Does it make sense to just put the content out there when no one's sort of consuming it? Is it just a production question? So definitely still some discussions about the CBC, and I'm certain that that will show up in our discussion boards later on. But we're going to switch gears a little bit now and talk next about national parks.